welcome to the SRA podcast. I'm Faye, and today I'm joined by co-founder of the SRA and former secretary, JL Hamilton.
Hey, hello.
So how you doing today?
I'm doing great. I just took my CCW class and test yesterday, so I'll be getting that soon.
Nice. And I hear you're also working on getting a short-barreled rifle set up.
That's correct. I submitted the paperwork in October of last year. It got approved in early November. It turned out that they were going through them really fast, and a lot of people's got messed up, but I was one of the lucky ones that got approved very quickly. And I got my Draco pistol and a AK-100 series side-folding stock, and I've sent it off to a gunsmith, and he's going to turn this into a short-barreled rifle.
Awesome. Now, I'm sure that a lot of people who are listening who aren't gun people are probably very confused. So this is sort of the topic of today's discussion is going to be NFA items, the National Firearms Act, and the various types of firearms and firearms accessories that are regulated by this law, and the history of this and how you can navigate it as a gun owner today. So let's talk real quick about what the NFA is. So National Firearms Act, it's a law that was passed in 1934 in the midst of the Great Depression to regulate a variety of different firearms. And I guess we should start with short-barreled rifles, since that's what you're working on right now.
All right, so a short-barreled rifle is defined as a rifle having a barrel length of less than 16 inches or an overall length of less than 26 inches. So if you've seen how do I describe this to someone who's not in what's the best example of a short-barreled rifle that you could think of? Getting a pistol AR and just adding a stock to it, or
So way back in the day, an example of a short-barreled rifle might be a pistol with a stock on it. If you've ever seen photos from World War I, they were used a lot in the Japanese War. One of those old C96 Mauser pistols with a stock on the back of it, that was considered a short-barreled rifle because essentially you had rifle sort of performance in a package that was small enough to be concealed under a coat. Now, of course, nowadays, when people talk about short-barreled rifles, what is more common is a sort of AR-15 or AK-style firearm, which is fitted out with a short rifled barrel and gas system, and generally a folding or a very short stock to get essentially an extremely compact assault rifle.
And the benefit, of course, being that it's much more maneuverable around corners. You can throw a suppressor on it, and then the overall length of your entire setup is about the same length of a typical rifle, but, not with all that added weight towards the muzzle.
Right. And so another similar category would be short-barreled shotguns. Of course, when people think of this, they generally think of a sawed-off shotgun where you take a double barrel and you saw it down to something that's something out of Mad Max, right?
Right. When I think of a short-barrel shotgun, I'm thinking about a particular incident that happened in my town where someone was shot with one at a gas station, and the police were looking for this guy all day.
Yeah, it's not really a thing in the cultural conscience to hear the idea of a short-barreled rifle being used in a crime, but short-barrel shotguns definitely have that reputation of a concealable weapon that is extremely attractive, for criminals, for robberies and things like that, because it's such a lethal weapon in such a compact package in comparison to a pistol. If you get hit by a pistol, there's a chance you might survive. With a shotgun, that's not really as likely. So short-barreled shotguns and short-barreled rifles were both restricted back in 1934 as part of this legislative package, which also put regulations on the usage of silencers, aka suppressors, machine guns, and what they called any other weapons, which is any sort of weird thing that Congress wasn't quite comfortable with at the time.
Yeah, so the any other weapon is this weird, in-between category. There are very few examples of these, actually. If I'm not mistaken, a lot of zip guns, if I wanted to make a keychain device that could fire a single shot round, I think this would be considered an any other weapon.
Cane guns are any other weapons, I believe.
Yeah, so these are things that are not typically sold, and they're also things that are not typically manufactured.
Definitely. So let's talk a little bit about the history of this law and how it came into being, because I think there are some parts of this law that make sense, but also some parts of it that are very particular to the time and place in which it was passed. Because any legislation is going to reflect, the anxieties of the time period. It's not necessarily something that's going to be reflective of reality decades later with changes in culture and technology. So, what was sort of the environment in which the National Firearms Act came into being?
So, Prohibition happens in 1920, and very soon afterwards, organized crime is using the black market to make lots of money. If alcohol is illegal, then if you can get to that market, then you're going to make a ton of money. So, the black market was organized into various gangs, and the gangs were regimented along national lines, with immigrants from various countries engaging in criminal business with their fellow expats. So you had the Irish gangs, the Italian gangs, the British gangs, the Jewish gangs, the Russian gangs, and so on. And there were a series of very high profile assassinations and mass shootings that were essentially just business moves made by the various gangs hoping to take out their competition. This culminated in 1929 with the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So on Valentine's Day, 1929, you had 7 men who were murdered in a garage North Clark Street in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago's North Side. They were shot by 4 men from the Italian Southside gang led by Al Capone, using weapons that included 2 Thompson submachine guns. And 2 of the other shooters were dressed as uniformed policemen, while others wore suits, ties, overcoats, and hats in order to make themselves look like police investigators. 5 of the victims were members of Chicago's Irish North Side gang, led by Bugs Moran. And as a result, there was this increasing pressure on Congress to regulate machine guns specifically, but also to regulate other guns that could be easily concealed on a person's body, because there was this genuine fear that the gang violence in the United States had just reached this boiling point and it needed to be squashed.
And I think it's also worth mentioning, the high profile bank robberies and road bandits during this time period. People like Bonnie and Clyde, you know, people don't necessarily look into the specifics of how they would rob banks, but Clyde often carried a Browning automatic rifle during these bank robberies, which was purchased legally because it was not regulated, using a fully automatic 30-06 machine gun to intimidate police officers and clerks. And there were other criminals like John Dillinger, who used a modified 1911 in 38 Super, which he equipped with a stock and a high-capacity magazine and modified to fire automatically so that he could walk into a bank and just spray the entire room with 20-odd rounds of 38 Super in a second and a half to just intimidate everyone into doing what he said. So you had this situation where you had both this gang mafia violence as well as bank robbers and road bandits using this readily available legal firepower that you could just buy at a hardware store.
Yeah, absolutely. So even though alcohol prohibition ended in 1930, gang violence and these bank robberies that you mentioned remained pretty high. If you had access to this firepower, it was an easy means for, someone who had a criminal intent to get money. So with all this pressure, various bills were put to Congress, and in 1934, June 26, the National Firearms Act was passed into law. So for the very first time, machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and suppressors would be regulated with a tax. So you'd have to pay a $200 fee in order to obtain one of these, and also extremely hefty penalties for violations.
As well as the original law included stringent FBI background checks, which are still in effect today, as well as requirements for getting approval from local law enforcement and requiring an interview, for instance, which was actually a restriction that was loosened under the Obama administration, surprisingly.
Oh, wow. And also fingerprints. You've got to get 2 copies of fingerprints, and these are sent to the ATF. And then once you receive approval, you have to send a copy of your approved application to your local chief law enforcement officer.
Now, keep in mind, we can do that today. Just download a form off the internet, print it out, fill it in, mail it out. In the 1930s, this is a bit more of an involved process. You have to actually visit a field office or write a letter to the ATF or the FBI and get these forms and fill them out. So this was really sort of strict legislation for the time in terms of, a $200 tax stamp, which is way more money back then than it is now.
Yeah, and today, this particular kind of registry of firearms probably would not pass. It's very difficult to imagine previously unregulated firearms being regulated at the federal level with like a registry of folks' names, addresses, fingerprint cards, and photos. The conservative base probably put that down immediately. They absolutely would not tolerate it. And of course, the liberals will take anything they can get. So if there was something on the table, it's unlikely that they would include a registry just so they could get that through. But it was a very different time. So you got to remember the late 1800s. 2 million Irish refugees came to the United States during the genocide of the Irish by the British. And this, of course, led to a major American nativist sentiments. You had a lot of white Americans who held a great deal of distrust for this perceived foreign influence, and the Irish laborers who came were heavily discriminated against, and they had a very difficult time getting jobs as a result. And when you throw this in with a number of Irish gangs committing high-profile assassinations of their, market competition, it is probably the case that this anti-Irish sentiment played a very large role, and especially older congressmen voting in favor of the NFA because of yellow journalism in the newspapers that were basically saying that Irish people were animals who wouldn't follow Protestant laws and answered only to the urges of violence and the demands of the Pope, but also the sentiments generally. Like, this is how white Americans felt.
Definitely. And it is important to note how the boundaries of whiteness are redefined over the years in order to benefit the class in power.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so the NFA regulated short barreled shotguns, short barreled rifles, suppressors, machine guns, any other weapons. So I think we should talk a little bit about suppressors. So there is, JL and I both did some research on this, and it's kind of murky. It's unclear exactly why suppressors were included in the National Firearms Act. There was no discussion of that provision on the House. It was just in the bill and was just passed with it. And so there's no official record of why that law was put into place, because suppressors, silencers, they aren't really used very often in crime or in assassinations the way that media often portrays them. I believe the number of assassinations carried out with suppressors in the United States in American history, in recorded American history, it's in the single digits. It's absurdly rare. Almost no one is killed with a suppressor. So the speculation is that suppressors were restricted under the NFA, which at the time was basically a ban for anyone who wasn't rich, because poor people during the Great Depression were using suppressed firearms to poach cattle, to go onto cattle ranchers' land, kill their cows quietly, and then escape with the meat. But there's no real record of this logic in, congressional records or any newspapers or anything that we could find.
It's very interesting because there were lengthy floor debates about machine guns, for example. You had opposition to the ban or the regulations, but there's absolutely nothing about suppressors.
And speaking of, so one of the things that I'm sure was difficult for Congress was defining what a machine gun is. Like, it's easy enough today to point at something and say that thing's full automatic, it's a machine gun. But that wasn't really clear. There wasn't a legal definition of a machine gun in 1934.
Right. In the original text of the National Firearms Bill that was not passed, this was later amended, but in the original text actually said that a machine gun should be considered as any automatic gun that can fire 12 or more rounds. So at the time, automatic was a term that was synonymous with self-loading, so what we would today call semi-automatic. So imagine any pistol that has a magazine capacity of 12 or more, that would have been illegal under the original text. But that's not what ended up happening. Machine gun ended up being defined as any firearm that can fire more than one round with a single press of the trigger.
With clarification that this does not apply to shotguns and other things that fire multiple projectiles with a single cartridge.
So, in order to obtain an NFA item, you have to pay the $200 tax stamp. And in 1934, I think it's worth pointing out that in 2020 terms, that would be worth almost $4,000, $3,850 to be exact. So you can see then how this law tried to essentially price the largely Italian and Irish gangsters, and really anyone who wasn't extremely wealthy, out of being able to afford a large arsenal of these items, while still allowing the wealthy whites the peace of mind of not only being able to afford the price hike, but also knowing that they probably wouldn't be targeted by any future crackdown levied with the aid of the new registry. This was a piece of legislation that specifically targeted the poor.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a case where the government at the time was very much working in the interest of wealthy white people. It was very much working in the interest of that sort of bourgeois class, if you want to get Marxist about it. It was very much, people didn't mind being put on a registry because that registry was essentially an assurance from the government that they wouldn't be bothered for, their ownership of these weapons. And the law would only be applied to people who couldn't afford to be on that registry or couldn't, pass those sorts of investigations. And so it created this two-tiered system, and wealthy gun owners were fine with the registry because the registry was protecting them. They didn't have the concerns that you hear nowadays with conservatives and gun owners in general being concerned about registries because of their potential for confiscation. That wasn't really on anyone's radar at that time.
Exactly. On the other hand, though, if you're looking at, inflation, you can see how NFA items are cheaper now than they ever have been since 1934, because $200 is not what it used to be, and the law just hasn't changed. So what used to cost someone in 2020 terms nearly $4,000, it's still just $200. And as time goes on, as long as inflation rates remain positive, that will ultimately mean that these NFA items will become cheaper and cheaper every single year.
Yeah, and so that it's interesting because that original intentional class division is sort of going away. Like it's obviously still a barrier, and NFA items in general are still like fairly expensive. They're more expensive than regular standard firearms. Like a suppressor, you're generally looking at a minimum $250 on top of that $200 tax stamp just for like a 22 caliber suppressor. So there is still a little bit of a barrier, but it's not really an upper class thing anymore. Anyone who has a baseline of financial security could potentially afford a short barreled shotgun or a suppressor or pretty much any of these items except a machine gun, which were affected by later legislation.
Most firearms are more expensive than the tax stamp, and this is obviously in contrast to how it used to be. The tax stamp would have been a major financial hurdle, but nowadays, if you want a suppressor, you can get one. And there are two major ways that you can do that. So I think we should talk a little bit about the ATF forms. And I think the suppressor will help us understand these various NFA forms. So if you want a suppressor, most people do the dealer-to-dealer transfer. And this is where a manufacturer of suppressors allows you to buy their suppressor, and then they transfer it to a federally licensed dealer, and it stays there until your ATF Form 4, that is the application to transfer an NFA item, is processed and approved. So it's kind of strange because you'll pay upwards of $1,000 for a high-end suppressor, but because the Form 4s take so long to process, you're actually not allowed to take it home until a year or more later. The other way that you can get a suppressor is through a Form 1, and the Form 1 is an application to manufacture a firearm, or I guess manufacture an NFA item. The suppressor can just be manufactured at your home after you get your Form 1 approval. What a lot of people do is they get these things that are called solvent traps. These are kind of a gray area, legally speaking, because as long as they don't function as a suppressor, they're not considered a suppressor, but they look very similar to a suppressor. Ostensibly, they're used to place solvents in the barrel of your gun to help clean it, but we all know what's going on. It is a tube that threads to your barrel and has an end cap. And the idea is that once you get your Form 1 approved, you can drill a hole in the end cap so that the bullet can go down the barrel and out the end of this device. And then you can add what are called cups. These are little bowls that have the same diameter as the inner diameter of the tube. And then you drill holes in these cups and you stack them so that it creates baffles within the tube. And in this way, you've created a suppressor. If you're more crafty, you can, of course, just go to your lathe and make one. But the Form 1 route is really cheap because you're paying $200 for the Form 1 approval, and buying these pre-made solvent trap kits is incredibly cheap. I mean, you can get, I think, a full kit for an additional $200, $300. And that definitely beats the high price of a Form 4 transfer, where most professionally made suppressors are going to cost at least $600.
Yeah, and of course, this does sort of also bring in another issue, which is that you have the federal laws, and the text of those laws is the law, but that law is interpreted by various agencies and by judges, and various precedents are set. So you can get into a situation where you have something like a solvent trap that is legal on a technicality, but could be rendered illegal by a determination by the ATF or by a ruling by a judge, and could result in this item that you own, which is technically legal, becoming technically illegal. And you may not even find out about it until weeks or months later when it hits the news. It's sort of a pitfall of working around the edges of American firearms law because it's always slightly changing with time.
So another example of this is the arm brace. So the ATF, as of right now, considers an arm brace that is a device that essentially looks like a stock but is not a stock. You either strap it to your forearm or you wedge it into the underside of your elbow in order to help you fire a pistol. But if you were to add a stock to a pistol, it becomes a short-barreled rifle. But if you add a arm brace to a pistol, the ATF says that's not an SBR. So there are a number of companies that are making arm braces that function very similarly to a stock, and yet the ATF turns a blind eye because the intent of this arm brace is to help stabilize your shots while you're shooting a pistol. But this has changed. It's been kind of up in the air a little bit. A couple of decisions have been made that have contradicted previous decisions. So originally, the ATF was saying that if you were using an arm brace on a pistol, that you couldn't shoulder. You couldn't bring it up to your shoulder and shoot it like a rifle, because that would make the arm brace an SBR.
But they couldn't enforce that.
Right, exactly.
And I'd like to remind people, if you're thinking of a pistol as in like a Glock or a 1911, yes, that does apply to this to a degree, but this mostly is in relation to AR pistols and AK pistols, rifles that have been chopped down with no stock and with, a short barrel so that they fit into the dimensions that the NFA would consider a pistol and are regulated as pistols. So an arm brace theoretically lets you shoot these little miniature rifles one-handed. So there was this original law saying, well, okay, we'll let you use these arm braces, but if you use it like a stock, then it's a short barrel rifle and we can prosecute you. But how are they going to prosecute that unless they have video evidence? It's like that New York safe law where they were saying, okay, well, you can keep your 10-round magazines, but if you put more than 7 rounds into it, then that's a felony. How is that enforceable? How does that actually protect anyone if this item is legal anyway, but there's just a penalty for using it a way that the government doesn't like? And so it was basically untenable for the ATF to enforce that law on arm braces, and they ended up being forced to make it legal because they also can't ban arm braces entirely because they do have genuine utility as single-handed shooting aids for people with various disabilities if they've lost an arm or if their support arm doesn't work properly for shooting. Like, this is a genuine tool that helps people that is also being used essentially as a end run around short-barreled rifle laws. But all of the law around this is not really law. It's based on the ATF's interpretation of the NFA, and it's based on various judges' rulings in various criminal cases for people who've gotten in trouble for riding that line between what's legal and illegal.
And this is one of the major benefits of going through the NFA process. Now, of course, there's the downside. You'll be in a federal registry, and I know a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about that. But in the case of someone who really wants to have an SBR but is currently using one of these arm braces, actually filling out a Form 1 or Form 4 and getting one of these transferred to you, or you manufacture one, this is kind of a way of protecting yourself from arbitration done not by legislation but by leadership within the ATF. Because at any time these things could become illegal, and by having your tax stamp, you're protected.
Yeah, and so it's, the gun industry always does this thing, and a lot of gun owners do this thing where they're always trying to find the loophole, the gray area, the sort of end run around what the law says in order to get something that is banned by the spirit of the law, but not by the text. And I think there's some good in that, especially when the law is poorly written or doesn't make sense. Certainly admire some of the creative solutions people found to deal with the assault weapons ban in 1994. So there is this tendency in the gun industry, but you always have to keep in mind that when you're doing this, you're always on the edge of what is legally allowable. And it's very easy to accidentally step over that or to have that ground fall away beneath you on the basis of an arbitrary ruling by a government agency or by a judge. And so dealing with the NFA process, you are putting yourself on a registry, you are filling out a bunch of forms and paying a bunch of fees, but it does put solid legal ground beneath your feet. And even if future laws or rulings are made in the future, if you have a registered item under the NFA, you're probably going to be in a better legal position when the law changes. You're more likely to be grandfathered, less likely to become a felon overnight if future laws are passed. So there is that sort of back and forth with it.
There are many ways to register a tax stamp. You can do this as an individual. You can do this as a trust. You can do this as a corporation. You can do this as a company. And there are some benefits here. So if you create a trust, very easy to do. You can go to LegalZoom.com and get this done in an afternoon. You can add family members. So if I have a suppressor and I die, if I have a responsible persons list attached to my Form 1 or Form 4, then it's legal for anyone else on my trust to take possession of this NFA item. Whereas if you file as an individual and something happens and another family member comes into possession of it, it's actually illegal for it to be in their home. You know, if you die and you have an NFA item, I think the best move there, I'm not a lawyer, but the best move to me sounds like that you should just destroy that item immediately, because otherwise you open yourself up to legal jeopardy.
Yeah. I mean, the real pro move is to just not die, but I want to talk about another area of the law that we haven't talked about a whole lot, which is machine guns. So we mentioned a little bit at the start the definition of a machine gun. You know, and machine guns were a large part of why the NFA passed in the first place. Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, the Valentine's Day Massacre. Machine guns have had sort of a longer history of legal registration beyond the NFA in general. So after the NFA passed, there was a long period where there were no real major changes at the federal level to firearms law, aside from judicial rulings sort of interpreting it and figuring out how it applies to different firearms. But there was this class barrier where really only wealthy people could legally own a machine gun. But, you know, it was still perfectly allowable to manufacture and sell machine guns. All sorts of companies would make machine guns, sell them to the military or to police, but then also have them available for civilian sale, for collectors, for people who just who are willing to go through the NFA process to acquire one. But then, sort of in the wake of World War II, something happened, which was that all these soldiers started coming back from Europe and from the Pacific and bringing all these war trophies, all these machine guns that were brought back from the front. Just, it's kind of insane to think about today, but the government would just let you bring weapons home. If you could hide it in your pack, or if you were friends with someone who was willing to look the other way, you could just bring a machine gun home. You could bring a German MG34 or MG42 home with you from Europe as a soldier. Or more often, people would bring submachine guns. A lot of MP40s and various other machine guns made it back. People would walk off military bases with, you know, American machine guns. Just, there was this theft and this war trophy culture that resulted in thousands and thousands of machine guns entering the civilian market unregistered, not going through the NFA process, just as part of the aftermath of World War II. And so there was this huge crisis of all these unregistered firearms, and once veterans started dying off or trading them or selling them, more of these weapons were being used in crime. And so when you get to like the 1960s, this is enough of a problem that the ATF is starting to become worried about it. And so in 1968, Congress passed the Gun Control Act of 1968, which was also in part brought on by the assassination of JFK, assassination of various civil rights leaders. This law did a lot of things. It banned the sale of mail order firearms. essentially forced people to go through federally licensed dealers instead of just having a rifle or even a machine gun just shipped to their home. So this was a major sort of change to firearms law. But one of the things that it did was this law created an amnesty period for people to register machine guns that were previously unregistered. There was a several-week period essentially where you could just bring in any machine gun and just register it with the ATF, and then it was legal. No questions asked, no strings attached. A lot of people were suspicious of it, but once people figured out that it was legit, some people took advantage of it. There was a case in 1968 where a soldier who was a conscript from the Vietnam War who did not give a shit just walked off base with a fully automatic M16 and then just sold it to a collector, and that collector immediately went to the ATF and registered this stolen military machine gun, just registered it legally. There were a couple similar cases of that, of just, Vietnam era firearms just disappearing from a military base and then being registered under the amnesty. So there was sort of a short-lived black market. And so there was this period where the government just tried to account for all these unregistered machine guns in circulation, just get them onto the registry, get them known so that, the government knew where they were. And this is a boon to collectors today, because most of the machine guns that did not get registered during this amnesty would later be destroyed, either through being used in criminal activity or through, their owners dying, the machine gun being discovered, and then the ATF taking possession and chopping it into pieces.
Right. So in 1986, there was the Hyde Amendment, and this banned the registration of new machine guns. So if you were an owner of a machine gun, you had a grace period to register it. But after that, the manufacture of new machine guns for the civilian market would be completely illegal. So there were only a few ways left to manufacture a full auto. That is, be a Type 1 FFL dealer with a Class 3 special occupational tax, or a Type 7 FFL manufacturer with a Class 2 special occupational tax. And what they do is they provide a way for dealers to create what are called post samples. This is post 1986 machine guns for the purposes of providing an example of the kind of gun that law enforcement could purchase from them. So it's a way of marketing their gunsmithing abilities. But also, a lot of people are not aware of this. You can also make post samples if it in some way can be used to justify marketing your business or making you money. So if you've ever seen someone on YouTube, maybe a gun YouTuber who has tons of subscribers and also has tons of machine guns for some reason, a lot of these are actually manufactured after 1986, fairly recently manufactured, because the cutoff in 1986 prevented the creation of new machine guns for civilians. That made those that were on the registry incredibly expensive. I mean, you're looking at a $30,000 expense for a machine gun, and in many cases. I think the cheapest machine, generally, I think the cheapest machine gun that you can buy is going to start at around 10 grand, maybe 7,000 on a lucky day.
So it's a little lower than that. So the Mac 10 and Mac 11 pistols, which you might be familiar with from movies and television, it's a machine pistol. Some people confuse them with Uzis, but they're these basically the cheapest possible blowback machine pistols manufactured during the 80s. There were various scandals and laws around them because after the Hyde Amendment passed, they continued to make them as semi-automatics, but they were easily convertible to machine guns by just grinding off a single metal pin, which is why the ATF also includes under its definition of machine gun firearms which are easily convertible to machine guns. So certain types of blowback firearms, including Mac 10s and Mac 11s that had this semi-automatic pin in them. So the Mac 10 and Mac 11, which are terrible guns, like practically speaking, are probably the most common and cheapest machine guns you can get. And for a period, they were going for around $2,000 or $3,000, but now due to increased interest, you're looking at around $3,000 to $5,000 to get one for the cheapest machine gun. But then, something like a fully automatic M16 or a fully automatic AK-47, you're talking $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. Thompson submachine gun, you're talking $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 depending on condition. Maxim guns going for $20,000 or $30,000. Like anything that you would look at and say this is a machine gun, $10,000 plus. All of this Uzis, $10,000 or $20,000. The market for it is just ridiculous because the only ones that are legal to purchase are ones that were registered before 1986. Since there are no new machine guns on the registry, I think there's a couple of ways that they can get onto the registry, but it's a very, very tiny number. It's just basically only the machine guns that already exist. And all these rich people are just bidding on this slowly shrinking number of machine guns, and the prices are just astronomical. Unless you have one of these dealer licenses or manufacturer licenses where you can make them yourself, which a lot of people are interested in doing, but very few people actually have the means or the dedication to actually follow through on.
Right. So if you want to be an FFL dealer, this opens you up to routine inspections from the ATF. They'll drop by and check your documentation, make sure that you're holding on to records, that kind of thing. And then, of course, if you're not, you're opening yourself up to hefty criminal prosecution. But I want to harp on this a little bit more. When the Mandalay Bay shooting happened in Las Vegas, and before we knew that bump stocks were involved, it was widely reported that people were hearing machine gun fire. And it was immediately clear to me that if this was the case, that meant that the shooter was a wealthy, probably white man, who could afford these NFA items. And it turned out I was right. He was a wealthy real estate investor. But of course, there were not machine guns involved.
So let's talk about bump stocks real quick, because this is, this sort of moment on bump stocks is past, but a bump stock is a device which allows you to bump fire a semi-automatic firearm. So bump firing is when you're essentially using the recoil of the gun as well as some of your own muscle energy to cause yourself to pull the trigger very rapidly. So I'm not going to go into detail on how to do the technique. You can look it up if you want. That's not really why we're here, but it's a method to emulate automatic fire out of a semi-automatic firearm at the cost of a great reduction in accuracy and controllability. And it's not technically a machine gun. So a bump stock is a device that helps you do that. It's a stock that slides and essentially helps you do that rapid pulling of the trigger action. And it's not technically a machine gun because instead of having a mechanical spring, you are actually using your own muscle energy to push the firearm forward against the force of recoil in order to have that cycling action where you're repeatedly pulling the trigger. So bump stocks make bump firing easier. You can still bump fire without a bump stock, but they do make it easier and a little bit more controllable.
So this was yet another example of how the ATF can just unilaterally decide that things are illegal without any kind of legislative push. President Trump said, "Hey, I want the ATF to take a look at this. What can they do?" The ATF replied, "Well, we'll just regulate bump stocks as if they're machine guns." And there were a number of court battles. It turns out that one person won their case, and he's like the only guy in America that's legally allowed to have a bump stock right now. But while that's ongoing, there does seem to be a bit of a legal challenge because machine gun is defined by congressional law, and it's not clear that the ATF can redefine what a machine gun is to suit their own regulatory needs. So we may see the legalization of bump stocks again. I feel like that's highly unlikely, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility.
Either way, though, I don't think, even if they are re-legalized, I don't think people should rush out to buy them. You get into this situation where, is this an actual useful firearm or is this a range toy? And I think that bump stocks very clearly fall into a toy category. And so I do think that there is a situation where you have to evaluate, is this item being legal? Does this provide any benefit to gun owners? And then balance that against what harm is this potentially able to cause to the general public. So if we do have this situation where machine guns are regulated in this way, and I do think some regulation on fully automatic weapons is justified, is having an easy loophole like a bump stock to get around that law, is that really desirable if it could lead to situations like Mandalay Bay? is the societal harm from it, does that outweigh the utility to gun owners? In the case of bump stocks, I think it does. You can get into other items where it goes the other way, where I think the utility to shooters outweighs the risks to public safety. Like high capacity magazines, I don't think are as dangerous as they are portrayed. In the case of bump stocks, I personally don't. I'm not going to go out on a limb to defend bump stocks.
Yeah, me neither. I also think they're toys. I never owned one. I never had a plan to own one. I think it's actually very difficult to find someone who, is really into gun culture, understands what they are, and still supports the proliferation of machine guns among the civilians, or even, I mean, in my case, the military.
Yeah, so let's talk about the sort of the cultural impact of NFA items and what's going on in the gun culture right now, because like you said, inflation is rendering the $200 tax stamp meaningless. While Trump is in office, the ATF has basically been rushing through ATF applications for suppressors and short barreled rifles. Essentially, the barrier to entry for these items is minuscule now. It's still there, but it's not as heavy a restriction as the law originally intended. So what is the sort of effect this change has had on gun culture?
Well, you're seeing a lot of short-barreled rifles with suppressors. You're seeing those more than you ever have before, especially in competition shooting. People are still wearing ear protection, but with subsonic rounds, you're taking out most of the noise. This is really great for competition shooters who are shooting a lot to help with their hearing. But it also, I think, plays into this media narrative of the scary black rifle. Because before there were a mix, I think, of what you would consider these Elmer Fudd type hunting rifles with the scary black assault rifles. And it was easy for the media to say, well, why don't you just own guns like Elmer Fudd? Why do you have to own guns like
Rambo?
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. So with the market kind of positioning itself to take advantage of how cheap the NFA has become, the tax stamp only being $200 from 1934 to 2020, because of that accessibility, the gun market is kind of positioning itself around that. It's a feedback loop that's going to continue to move in that direction of the scary black rifle. And it makes sense. You could have a long barrel gun, but for people who are buying AR-15s for home self-defense, for example, SBRs make a lot of sense. It is easier for you to get around corners, put a flashlight on it, you're golden, put a suppressor on it. You can take it competition shooting, take it to the range. You're not, hurting your hearing more so than you need to. So we're probably going to be seeing a lot of these in the media more and more. And it may impact the national dialogue about gun control. I think it could go one of two ways. Either people realize that suppressors are now used all the time, everywhere, and a lot of gun owners own them, and it's not leading to an increase in assassinations or secret murders. And we get some kind of, I don't know, maybe like the Hearing Protection Act, where it just kind of becomes normalized, like it is in England, where you can buy suppressors over the counter. Or we could go the other way, because the $200 tax stamp hasn't changed, and it's because of inflation becoming more affordable, and there are more of these NFA items out in the public sphere. The media can then say, well, look, there are just more and more of these scary black rifles. We need to do something about it. And it could potentially lead to a greater push for gun control.
Yeah, there was this narrative in the media for a long time of just banning assault weapons and then letting, sort of less frightening weapons. Like there's always that comparison between the AR-15 and the Ruger Mini 14, where you have two rifles that are fundamentally the same in terms of function, both semi-automatic 223 caliber rifles with 30 round magazines, but the Ruger has a traditional wood stock and looks like an M1 Garand kind of, whereas the AR-15 is this scary black thing with stuff sticking out all over it. It has a pistol grip and skeletized bits. And so when you have that sort of contrast, it's easy for media to say, let's just ban the scary ones. Let's ban the so-called assault weapons. But then when the more traditional style of weapons are no longer a significant presence in the gun market, which they are not. I mean, just as a matter of economics, a Ruger Mini 14 costs something like $600 generally, whereas you can get an entry-level AR-15 for $400 that is better in every way. So why would you ever buy the Ruger? That market segment disappears. Those sorts of non-assault weapons become a smaller and smaller chunk of the market. So it sort of incentivizes politicians in the media to focus more on banning guns in general, which in turn, I think ramps up the sort of conflict. It sort of feeds into this narrative of gun owners being worried about confiscation or total gun bans, because that's more and more of what the media and politicians like Beto O'Rourke are arguing for.
I'm curious if politicians in 2020 would take a lesson out of history and would just raise the tax stamp. What if tomorrow Congress passed a law to say that in order to own an NFA item, you have to pay a $5,000 tax stamp? That would certainly prevent the proliferation of more NFA items, but it would also create, again, this class divide within firearms ownership. Something I would oppose.
Yeah, same. It's like class should not be the dividing factor here. If you want to have a division like that, it should be, I don't necessarily agree with licensing or training requirements either, because I think those also have significant classist elements. But that's a more justifiable position than saying we're just going to tax the hell out of it so poor people can't afford it.
Absolutely. So with that said, we're probably looking at, just as a byproduct of accessibility now and affordability, my gut tells me that we're looking at more gun control, just generally across the board. This conversation we're having now, I could easily see being a Vox video about why we need to just ban these things, because setting arbitrary price limits hasn't worked in the past.
Yeah, on the other hand, I do think that because of the Republican bloc in Congress serving as a dam against a lot of gun control, although that dam is weakening with Republicans in purple districts or in, just slightly Republican-leaning districts receiving pressure on the basis of mass shootings in or near their districts. So that firewall is not as powerful as it once was. That said, I do think that any congressional gun reform or gun legislation that comes through is probably going to have at least some sort of compromise. Like, we might see an assault weapons ban paired with a legalization of suppressors, or with certain items being removed from the NFA. I think that sort of compromise might be possible. But on the other hand, if a Democrat with strong urges towards gun control gets into office, we could see some very draconian interpretations of the NFA being passed down by the ATF, by whoever is installed as director. If Joe Biden wins and puts Beto O'Rourke in as head of the ATF, he's probably going to apply the strictest possible definition to, essentially legalize as many firearms as possible. It's sort of a mixed forecast.
When I saw that news report about Beto O'Rourke, it became clear to me that Joe Biden was not going to win the election. Even if he wins the nomination, there's just no chance.
Well, he's certainly losing Florida on the basis of that, and possibly might lose North Carolina on that basis as well. Probably won't win Arizona. So I guess it's I don't know. Is he going to be able to win Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania with those stances on gun control? Maybe.
It's a good question.
Maybe. I don't know.
He'd certainly lose my home state of Georgia.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think Georgia is in play anyway. Even with Bernie, I think it would be a long shot. But with that sort of stance on gun control, there's no chance at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that pretty well wraps things up. So thank you for coming on the program. Do you have any projects that you want to promote? You want to send people to your social media? Anything you want to talk about?
Yeah, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Absinthol, ABSINTHOL. But other than that, no, I don't really have anything to promote right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having this discussion.
Yeah, it was great being on.